The first is the injustice and suffering of political prisoners and the pain and torment of their families, and you've witnessed it this morning in the words of Ensaf Haidar, among others. And second, the impunity of human rights violators. The very candidates for election to the UN Human Rights Council who have been highlighted here, who have been engaged in the imprisonment, torture, and murder of their own people and political prisoners amongst them, as they assault the very values that underpin the mandate of the UN Human Rights Council. Let me begin with the first theme, the pain and torment and injustice suffered by political prisoners and their families. As counsel for political prisoners, as Hill has mentioned, for some 40 years now, the patterns of persecution and prosecution and pain and injustice imposed by these human rights violators are everywhere the same. First, the criminalization of innocence. It's not what these political prisoners do, it's who they are. People who stand up for human rights, democracy, and freedom. Two, the criminalization of fundamental freedoms. Raif Badawi is a case study of the criminalization of freedom of religion, speech, assembly, association, and conscience. And similarly, what has happened to those in Russia who have done the same. The third is the torture in detention. Reference was made to Tiana Wang, the daughter of Wang Bizang. Wang Bizang has been not only imprisoned, but in standing torture in China for 14 years now, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, which the UN Special Rapporteur characterized as torture, just as the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention characterized his imprisonment as illegal. A fourth has been assassination. We have Oswaldo Paya in Cuba, and I want to mention this morning Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was the leading democracy advocate, in fact, the leader of the opposition, democratic opposition in Russia, who came to Canada, and we held a joint press conference with him with regard to human rights violations in Russia, who was tragically murdered over 18 months ago. His successor, Vladimir Kara-Murza, was poisoned while in Russia and almost died in that regard, and I can go on. A pattern of, as I say, not only persecution and prosecution, but in fact, assassination and murder. And number five, the harassment of the families. One example, Tiana Wang, whose father I just mentioned has been in a Chinese prison for 14 years in solitary confinement, has been refused the right to even visit her father, notwithstanding the fact that he has suffered a series of debilitating strokes in prison. And finally, to conclude this pattern, the state-sanctioned orchestration of all these patterns of persecution and prosecution and harassment and brutality, which brings me to the second theme, and moving to a close, and that is the culture of impunity that attends all this. It is a shocking rebuke to the United Nations itself.